Okay, so this is part two, 1950s culture. So we were just talking about teenage culture and the idea of a new subculture in that of the beatniks. So kind of a scrungy, grubby looking guy here, and then a clean teen would be kind of the early version of preppy, but that's a couple decades away. Up here, each of these artists or authors really create the idea of a beat generation. Moving on, um, behavior in the 50s was pretty rigid as far as culture and expectations of teens. So, one, obeying authority was a pretty high value um, for most teenagers. They were expected to obey their elders and people in authority. You were expected to control your emotions. So, outbursts of anger or sadness were seen as undesirable, that you wanted to maintain a good front even if things weren't good. So don't make waves was a pretty common um, catchphrase, and fit in with the group. So this idea of kind of assimilating to the larger cultural group was a pretty highly advocated position for young people at that time. And don't even think about sex was another common phrase. So sexual behavior in the 50s was among teenagers was um, highly undesirable. That there was a lot of stigma attached to any involvement in that. Moving on, America does change. Today in the U.S., the Christian faith is back in the center of things, says Time magazine. And so church membership does skyrocket from 64 million to 114 million in 1960. That probably helps with all those babies going to church as well. But nevertheless, the idea of television preachers emerged. So church is seen as an important in the development of moral character for young people, but also that it was a social gathering, and the idea of television preachers, big preachers such as Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, um, so Life is Worth Living, as well as Methodist minister Norman Vincent Peale. The power of positive thinking was a new idea at that time, that you could, as long as you had positive thoughts, you could get your way out of difficult situations. And probably most famous was Billy Graham, who, one, warned against the evils of communism, but also came to evangelize millions of people in big kind of events where he would share the Christian message. So,
hear, O Israel, remember this day when the strong hand of the Lord leads you out of bondage.
all right, there we hear Charlton Heston as Moses in the blockbuster in the 50s, The Ten Commandments. So we see various biblical movies, Ben-Hur, and so this is the Hollywood generation of big Bible movies, made lots of money. And something we would have maybe a little more of a difficult idea understanding, but this quote here, it's un-American to be unreligious, says the Christian Century in 54. So this idea that all Americans were religious, or should be, was highly kind of believed. Moving on, ideas about men and women. The ideal modern woman: married, cooked, cared for her family, kept herself busy by joining the local PTA, leading a troop of campfire girls, or similar to Girl Scouts. She entertained guests in her family's suburban house and worked out on the trampoline to keep her size 12 figure. So this was an expectation of women. So somebody like Marilyn Monroe kind of set that, but also began to emerge as kind of a popular sex symbol. So women were definitely pretty still defined by these kind of characteristics. And men, the ideal of the man was to be the provider, the protector, and the boss. So once again, this idea of the organization man, a middle-class white suburban male, this suit and tie guy is the way to go in the 50s. Moving on, gender roles. There was some change. Alfred Kingsley publishes 2 books about, of all things in the 50s, sex, and male and female. And people had a lot of interest in that, in the changing sexual behavior, because despite whatever idea of the time, premarital sex in the 50s was pretty common. And extramarital affairs also were pretty frequent, according to his study and the information he published in these books. This kind of opens some people's eyes in America, and as well as makes some people very surprised and upset. So he was a very controversial figure in the late 40s and 50s. So Kingsley's results are an assault on the family as the basic unit of society, and a negation of the moral law and the celebration of licentiousness. So Life magazine is not a big fan of Alfred Kingsley. And last but not least, we're going to change society by science. Okay, as I previously stated, some of the first computers get created in the 1950s, so a lot of progress through science. The first hydrogen bomb, which is incredibly more powerful than the first atomic bombs, were tested in 52. We figure out that humans are made from DNA in 53. There's finally a vaccine for polio in 54. The U.S. Creates the first commercial power plant, so that atomic energy is being used, not just for weapons, but to power homes. NASA is created as the space race begins to heat up, and the press conference of the first American astronauts. So all of these, science is a big push in the 50s as far as cultural impact. Continuing, the Russians launched this satellite called Sputnik. There he goes. Check him out. All right, in 1957, and this really surprises America. And so we decide the best way to combat this idea is to fund education. Kind of a novel idea, not one that's in high regard today, but kind of a similar idea that we're finding ourselves behind the times, and so we're going to fund math and science. Today we call that STEM education. And some more progress, or somewhat related to science at least, lots of people beginning to see UFOs in the 1950s. So movies are popularized this idea of Martians and flying saucers and invading green men. This all probably has some indication of aliens as a metaphor for who do you think? I'll leave that as an open question. Maybe we can talk about it in class. And the last progress is all right, in case you weren't aware, that would be the drill test noise for the duck and cover generation, in which you are going to be protected from atomic blasts by getting under your desk and putting your hands over your head. This is still what we use for tornado drills, so it's kind of funny, but yeah, there were common drills to prepare for an atomic attack. This was a high anxiety, and this leads to the idea of creating fallout shelters. You've probably seen these in some really old buildings, and building your own bomb shelter in your backyard would keep you safe, apparently. So the U.S. did explode a lot of weapons from 46 to 62, so there was maybe some rationale for it, but a lot of paranoia having to do with atomic weapons. And the 1950s come to a close with the kitchen debate. We already talked about that a little bit. So a debate between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev about the contributions each society is having. America obviously thinks it's best, and Khrushchev thinks differently. So there they are, checking out the American yeah, the American version of a kitchen. And so these Cold War tensions in technology are what they think are looming us towards an atomic war. And here's a discussion that we'll probably have here. The post-war era witnessed tremendous economic opportunity and growth and rising social contentment and conformity. Yet, in the midst of such increasing affluence and comfortable domesticity, social critics expressed a growing sense of unease with the American culture in the 50s. So, is this valid or not? And explain how the 1950s maybe laid the groundwork for social and political turbulence in the 60s. Um, and now a quick review, some main ideas. Here we go. So the idea of baby boomers, you should definitely understand that concept of a huge growth in population after the war years, suburbanization, that Americans are changing the where they live, and that has a lot of impacts. And Levitt towns were the first example of that. Consumerism, that American economies were going to be spurred by consumer credit, that you could just buy stuff on credit and get what all you wanted, the American dream on credit card. And the changing workplace, that automation machines take the place of workers, and consolidation that big companies form, and a business culture forms of pretty rigid standards. Cars change the way we live and work and move, especially once we get highways. And people flock to the Sunbelt states, the South and the Southwest in California. And TV certainly changes our lives forever. How we entertain ourselves and get access to information. The idea of a teen culture emerging, listening to a different type of music and kind of a subculture beatniks, not conforming to the social structure in the 50s, religious revival, so people are flocking back to the church. And gender roles are pretty well defined. There's an idea of an ideal man and a woman, but there's also changing behavior and the idea of sexuality. And last but not least, science and A-bombs, that numerous scientific advancements happen, but also there's this looming threat of an atomic bomb and war being launched. That is it. If you guys have questions, please ask.